Okay, so as promised, I am going to go over slide 25 and 27. This is figure 2-14 from your book, the primary and secondary antibody response. So in the lecture for chapter 2, we talked about how there are 4 phases to any immune response: the lag phase, log phase, plateau phase, and decline phase. So the table or the graph in figure 2-14 is showing you both a primary response. I often write primary as a 1 with a little circle next to it. Yeah, you guys can see that? Okay. And I write secondary as a 2 with a little circle next to it, just as a shorthand way to write those. And so in the primary response, you have antigen entry. So the antigen gets in the body. This is what is going to start this immune response. The antigen gets in the body. And so it's recognized as foreign. So that is starting our lag phase. And during the lag phase, if you remember, the antigen is recognized. We are going to activate T cells. We are going to have T cells telling macrophages to come and eat more antigen. We are going to have possibly neutrophils coming in if this is a bacterial infection. We are going to have B cells becoming plasma cells and eventually making antibody. So all of this can take up to 12 weeks after a primary exposure to an antigen. And so once that lag phase is complete and we start seeing the amount of antigen increase, we have entered the log phase, where we are getting an exponential increase in the amount of antibody that is being made. So once the plasma cells are making enough antibody that now we're fighting off the antigen, the amount of antibody we see is going to level off or plateau. Try that again. It's going to plateau. And we're going to have a steady amount of antibody. And eventually, the B cells are going to stop making antibody, and much of that antibody is going to be used up in the fight against the foreign antigen. And so we're eventually going to see a decline in the amount of antibody. And it's going to be a pretty rapid decline. Now, during this time, we talked about how there are 2 different kinds of antibodies that are made. First, the body is going to make IgM antibody. These are the pentamer-shaped antibodies, the 5 Y shapes that are put together. And these are the main antibodies made early in any disease, but especially in a primary exposure. And then eventually, the amount of IgM that is being made is going to decrease because the immune system is going to class switch or switch to the class IgG antibody and make those instead. And those IgG antibodies are the single Y-shaped antibodies. And we want to make those because they last longer. And the idea is to have long-term protection from the production of these antibodies. Now, in the second exposure, or a secondary amnestic booster response, you're going to have the same phases happening. You are going to have a lag phase, but the difference here is that, and that's why there's like a little break in your diagram, it's a new exposure. This could happen very quickly or years and years later. There's going to be a shorter lag phase. There is going to be a very steep log phase with a much higher level of antibody being made. There is going to be a plateau eventually and a decline for the same reasons there were in the primary response. But the plateau and the decline is much less steep. You keep a higher level in that secondary phase for a longer period of time. Also, another big difference is that although we begin by making IgM just like we did before, that class switching happens much more early because the memory cells of the immune system remember how to make IgG, and they make much more of it. Okay, and then this is, of course, the IgM. All right, so the predominant type of antibody made in the secondary phase is IgG, even though there is a little bit of IgM at the beginning, and you have much more antibody being made. And remember that the purpose of vaccination is so that if you ever do get infected with the thing you got the vaccine against, your body already knows how to make antibodies, knows how to make them quickly and efficiently, and hopefully you don't actually get a severe infection or disease. Now you'll see at the bottom of this diagram, there are some little circles. Those little circles are your B cells. And so what this is showing you is during the lag phase, you are getting activation of B cells. So here's one little B cell here, and it gets activated. And when a B cell gets activated, it's going to make more B cells. And eventually, those B cells are going to continue and continue and continue to multiply. And they also, once you get to log phase, start turning into plasma cells and start making antibodies. So some of these will become plasma cells. I'm going to draw these as a more wonky looking activated cell that's pumping out antibodies. But then we also have to remember that a small portion of these B cells are not activated to make antibodies. What they become are memory cells. And the memory cells are the ones that will hang around and wait for the second response, the secondary infection. And so those memory cells are the ones that remember how to do everything very efficiently. So when that second activation happens and they divide and they want to make more B cells, of course, some of these B cells are going to become plasma cells and they're going to make antibodies. That's going to help get this really high level of IgG really quickly. But again, we have to make sure some of these cells don't become plasma cells. They have to become those memory cells to carry the memory forward through the rest of that person's life. I hope that this has been really helpful to you, and you can use this information in addition to the information I gave you in the lecture on the audio to complete your primary and secondary response, antibody response assignments.